June 6, 1944. Before most people even know what Overlord means, the first American waves are already fighting for their lives. Cold water, heavy gear, bullets snapping so close it feels like the air itself is cracking. On Omaha Beach, the sand becomes a place men don't forget, if they live long enough to remember. Here's the part we all know in America. D-Day was the moment the United States proved it could lead the biggest amphibious invasion in history. Eisenhower in charge, American troops hitting the beaches, American industry flooding Europe with ships, trucks, steel, and firepower. It's the story we grew up with, and it's not made up. American sacrifice at Normandy was real, brutal, and massive. But there's another layer to that day that most Americans barely hear about. Not the courage. The courage is obvious. I'm talking about the blueprint, the architecture, the long, quiet work that turns courage into a victory instead of a catastrophe. Because when German commanders and staff officers tried to explain why the invasion worked, a pattern shows up again and again in what they focused on. The planning felt British in its design, even when the troops hitting them were overwhelmingly American. Now I need to be careful here, because the internet is full of fake diary quotes and made-up lines people wish someone had said. We're not doing that. We're sticking to what historians can actually document: who planned what the Allied command structure looked like, which programs were British-led, and why the German reaction makes more sense when you see the British fingerprints on the operation. And if you've only ever watched D-Day through American movies, you're missing a huge piece of the story. Quick favor before we get deep into it. If you like WWII stories that cut through the myth and get to what really happened, tap subscribe and keep the bell on. This channel is built for people who want receipts, not just recycled scenes. All right, let's dismantle the America Planned It All version the way it deserves to be dismantled, step by step. Think about the D-Day movies and series most Americans have seen. They show blood, chaos, bravery, and leadership. But when it comes to the months and months of planning, especially the early planning, the British side often fades into the background. You might catch a few British faces, a few quick briefings, a couple of accents in a crowded room. But the story usually lands on one idea. America designed the operation and everyone else mostly followed. That's the cultural memory. The military reality is more complicated. By the time Eisenhower took over as Supreme Allied Commander in early 1944, a major invasion plan for Northwest Europe already existed. It wasn't a vague concept. It had key building blocks: the overall approach, the general landing area, the need for airborne drops, the problem of ports, the need for deception to pin down German reserves, the supply math, and the reality that the first days would decide everything. The early engine room for this was a British-led planning organization in London known as Cossack, Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander designate. It sounds bureaucratic because it was, but that bureaucracy mattered. Cossack's job was to design an invasion plan before the final commander was even chosen and before every detail was locked. The man at the center of that early planning effort was a British officer, Lieutenant General Frederick E. Morgan. If that name doesn't ring a bell, you're not alone. Ask 10 random Americans who planned D-Day, and most will say Eisenhower. A few might name Montgomery. Almost nobody says Morgan. Yet Morgan and his team were doing the heavy lift when the invasion was still a question mark. And they weren't working out of some glamorous war room set with flags and dramatic lighting. They were grinding through the unsexy details that decide whether an invasion lives or dies. Beach gradients, tide windows, landing craft limits, supply throughput, air cover, German defenses, the timing of darkness and moonlight. And what happens if the enemy throws armored divisions at you on day one? Here's a key truth that often gets lost. Britain had been at war since 1939. By 1943, Britain had years of hard-earned experience in amphibious planning, combined operations, coastal raids, and large-scale deception. The United States had incredible strengths, production manpower, and growing operational skill, but Britain had been solving the "how do we even do this?" problem for longer. That doesn't mean Americans were clueless. It means the Allies were a coalition where different partners brought different advantages, and Britain's advantage was, very often, planning, infrastructure, and specialized problem-solving. And that shows up in what the invasion required, because D-Day wasn't just land on a beach, it was an entire system. You had to choose a landing area that could be supplied and expanded. You had to pick a date and time where tides, light, and weather gave you a chance. You had to trick the Germans into holding their best units in the wrong place. You had to solve the port problem, because if you can't unload enough supplies, your beachhead gets crushed. You had to move fuel, ammo, food, and reinforcements across the channel at a pace no one had ever attempted. If you miss any one of those, bravery doesn't save you. So what did Morgan's staff actually do? They built the first coherent Overlord plan that could be handed to the eventual Supreme Allied Commander. They took broad Allied intent, invade Northwest Europe in 1944, and turned it into something concrete. Not perfect, not final, but real. And when Eisenhower arrived, he didn't toss the plan in the trash and start from scratch. The concept and framework were already there. Changes were made, refinements were made, and leadership mattered enormously. But the early architecture wasn't invented in 1944 by Americans arriving fresh to London. It came out of a British-led planning machine that had been running for months. This is where the America's greatest victory was planned entirely by Britain argument usually gets shouted in a way that makes historians roll their eyes, because entirely is too simple. The Allies were integrated, Americans were involved, American logistics and manpower were fundamental. Eisenhower's coalition leadership was vital, but the core of the point still stands. The early blueprint that made D-Day workable was built largely in Britain by British planners, inside British institutions, using British experience, then executed by a combined force where Americans provided a huge portion of the assault power. And the Germans noticed the style. German commanders were not sitting around thinking, "This is an American movie, let's talk about the British." They were trying to understand how they got hit so hard, so precisely, across so many domains at once. When professionals analyze defeat, they tend to talk about what beat them: deception, timing, coordination, unusual equipment, and operational structure. That's why their assessments, in general terms, often emphasize the kind of layered, methodical approach Britain had become known for, especially in deception and specialized engineering. Now, let's pause and ask the obvious question. If this planning story is so important, why do most Americans barely know the names? Because memory isn't just history. Memory is culture. After the war, American audiences naturally consumed American stories. American newsreels showed American troops. American families mourned American dead. Hollywood made American movies with American heroes for American theaters. And again, those stories weren't fake. Omaha Beach really was an American bloodbath. American units really did pay heavily to get off that sand. But culture has a habit of turning the camera away from the people in offices who build the plan, even when that plan is the reason the people on the beach have a fighting chance. And Britain didn't have the same global media dominance after 1945 that the United States did. America's version became the global default, even when the coalition reality was more complex. So let's zoom back to the planning phase, because this is where the whole debate becomes real instead of emotional. By 1943, the Allies knew they had to get into France. The Soviets were bearing the crushing weight of the ground war in the East, and the pressure for a second front was constant. But "we need to invade" is not the same thing as "we can invade." That's why Cossack mattered. Morgan's job was to build an invasion plan that could survive reality. Not optimism, reality. And one of the smartest things about that planning effort was this: it didn't assume Britain would provide most of the troops. It assumed the opposite. By 1944, the Americans would supply a huge amount of the manpower. Everyone understood that. So the planning had to create something Americans could scale up and execute with their mass, without losing control of the details that make the first days survivable. That means clear landing sectors, defined objectives, realistic supply flow, and a deception plan strong enough to keep German reserves from smashing the beachhead before it could breathe. This is not glamorous stuff, but it's the difference between a foothold and a massacre. And it's also where British wartime innovation starts to peek through, because Britain had been working on invasion problems since early in the war. specialized armor to beat obstacles, engineering solutions for beaches, and the idea that if you couldn't count on capturing a port, you might have to bring a port with you. You've probably heard the big names of D-Day, Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, Rommel. Those names are deserved, but the deeper you go into what made the invasion mechanically possible, the more you run into British-driven programs and British-led concepts, specialized engineer vehicles, amphibious tank work, artificial harbor systems, fuel supply ideas, and, maybe most importantly, British-run counterintelligence and deception systems operating inside the United Kingdom. And that last part, deception, is where this story really starts to tighten its grip. Because D-Day didn't just succeed because the Allies were strong. It succeeded because the Germans were wrong. Wrong about where the main blow would fall, and wrong long enough for the Allies to get established. So here's where we're going next. 3 pillars that shaped the entire invasion. First, how the landing area and terrain logic pushed the Allies toward Normandy. Second, how the date and timing windows were brutally narrow, and why the invasion schedule wasn't picked by vibes. It was picked by math. Third, the deception effort that convinced German leadership to hold major forces away from Normandy when it mattered most. And once you see those 3 pillars, you'll understand why D-Day feels less like a spur-of-the-moment American master plan and more like a coalition operation where Britain built much of the early framework. Then American power helped execute it at a scale Germany couldn't stop. That's part 1. In part 2, we're going to get specific about how that framework worked, without leaning on fake quotes or made-up war room drama, because the real story is already dramatic enough. Let's get concrete. If you want to know who planned D-Day, you don't start with speeches or movie scenes. You start with the 3 problems that could have killed the invasion before lunchtime. Where do you land? When do you land? How do you keep German reserves from crushing you while you're still stuck on the beaches? These aren't trivia questions. They're life and death math. Pillar 1. Where, why Normandy was chosen. Most people assume Normandy was picked because it was close enough and not as defended. That's only part of it. A serious staff doesn't just ask, "Can we land there?" They ask, "Can we still be alive there 48 hours later?" The planners had to weigh beach slopes, tides, sand firmness, obstacles, and German fortifications, but also what came after: roads inland, terrain that could help the Allies expand, and the ability to bring in supplies fast enough to keep the beachhead from being sealed off. Normandy had weaknesses. It was farther from England than Pas-de-Calais, which meant a longer sea crossing and more risk. But it also had strengths that mattered if you were thinking beyond the first wave: room to expand, routes toward key objectives, and an angle that made it harder for the Germans to instantly pile everything onto you if you could keep them confused long enough. That "if" is the whole story, and that's why you can't separate beach selection from deception. Normandy wasn't just a place. It was a bet, one that required the Germans to be wrong at the exact moment the first troops stepped off those landing craft. Pillar 2. When the date wasn't vibes, it was a checklist. Now the timing. People talk about June 6th like it was some symbolic date carved in stone. It wasn't. The date had to satisfy multiple conditions at the same time, and the overlap was narrow. You needed a tide situation that exposed obstacles so engineers could clear lanes. You needed enough light for pilots and paratroopers to find their drop zones. You needed dawn timing that lined up naval gunfire, aircraft, and the first assault waves. And you needed weather that wouldn't smash the entire armada or ground air support. That combination doesn't happen every week. It's a limited window. That's why, when the final decision came, the Allies weren't choosing from endless options. They were choosing from a short list of acceptable days. And once weather turned bad, the decision got even tighter. This is where leadership matters too. Eisenhower's role wasn't show up and invent the whole plan. It was taking a complex Allied machine and making it move together at the critical moment, politically and militarily, when hesitation could mean missing the window. So yes, coalition command matters enormously, but the date logic, the hard constraints, was built into the plan before the final go order. Pillar 3. How? The deception that bought the beachhead "I'm now." We get to the part that changed everything. The Germans weren't stupid. They expected an invasion. They had eyes on the Channel coast. They had reconnaissance. They had an entire defensive system. And they had one huge advantage. If they correctly identified the main landing area, they could concentrate their mobile reserves and try to shove the Allies back into the sea. So the Allies had to win a second battle before the first beach was even hit. They had to win the battle inside the German command's head. That's where Operation Fortitude comes in. As part of the broader deception plan tied to Overlord, the deception goal was simple to describe and hard to execute: convince German leadership that the main Allied invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy, and keep them believing it long enough that key German units stayed in the wrong place while the real beachhead grew. Why Pas-de-Calais? Because it was the obvious choice. It's the shortest route across the Channel. It's closer to Germany. It has ports nearby. If you were guessing, you'd guess Calais. So the deception didn't fight logic. It used logic. It built a fake story that fit what the Germans already believed. A big piece of that story was a phantom force, the supposed 1st U.S. Army Group, often shortened to FUSAG, commanded by George Patton, who the Germans viewed as one of the most aggressive American commanders. In reality, Patton was used as a decoy in England, while the real invasion force prepared elsewhere. And here's where Britain's home front intelligence structure becomes a weapon. By 1944, British counterintelligence had developed a powerful system for controlling and managing enemy agents inside the United Kingdom. The Allies didn't just hope the Germans would be fooled by fake tanks. They aimed to control what German intelligence believed through a mix of double agents, managed communications, and carefully constructed evidence. One of the most famous double agents in this system was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. Handled by British intelligence officers, his value wasn't that he sent one dramatic message. His value was that over time, he built credibility in German eyes through a steady stream of reports, so that when it mattered most, Berlin was primed to believe him. That's the ugly brilliance of deception. It's not the final lie, it's the long setup. And deception wasn't just spies. It was also fake radio traffic, signals meant to suggest units were massing and training in southeast England. It was dummy equipment, inflatable tanks, staged vehicles, fake camps, placed where German reconnaissance could spot proof. It was controlled leaks and a consistent narrative that reinforced itself. The point wasn't to fool one German analyst. The point was to create an intelligence picture that kept German decision-makers stuck in place. And it worked well enough that even after the Normandy landings began, German leadership hesitated on pulling key forces away from Pas-de-Calais because they feared Normandy might be a diversion and the real invasion still wasn't here yet. That hesitation was oxygen. Every day the Germans delayed committing certain formations was a day the Allies unloaded more men, more guns, more vehicles, and more supplies. This is why, when people say bravery won D-Day, they're only telling half the truth. Bravery mattered, but bravery alone doesn't prevent a counterattack by fresh armored units. Time prevents that. Confusion prevents that. A delayed decision prevents that. The moment Germans saw something they didn't expect. Let's connect deception back to the beaches. On D-Day, the Germans didn't just encounter a lot of Americans. They encountered an invasion that arrived with unusual solutions to very specific problems. Obstacles, mines, seawalls, and fortified points that were designed to turn a landing into a slaughter. And at some beaches, especially those hit by British and Commonwealth forces, specialized armored vehicles appeared that weren't normal battlefield tanks. They were purpose-built machines for one job: cracking open a defended coast fast. This is where Major General Percy Hobart and the British 79th Armored Division come in. Hobart's Funnies is the nickname people remember, but the important part is what they did. Mine-clearing tanks that could beat or flail the ground to set off mines safely. Armored engineer vehicles built to place bridges, fill ditches, or smash obstacles. Specialized assault vehicles meant to get through defenses that would stall ordinary units. These weren't movie props. They were practical answers to deadly problems. The Allies also used amphibious tanks, most famously the dday tanks, duplex drive designs developed and refined in Britain to try to get armor onto the beach early. The performance of DD tanks varied by beach and conditions, but the concept mattered: armor support as fast as possible in the first hours. This isn't about Britain did everything. It's about recognizing that many of the niche, technical solutions, the weird, specific machines that did weird, specific jobs, were British-led developments that were integrated into the invasion system. And those solutions mattered because D-Day was not one battle. It was dozens of battles happening at once, all chained together. If engineers can't clear lanes, supplies choke. If supplies choke, infantry gets isolated. If infantry gets isolated, the beachhead collapses. The biggest problem of all: how do you supply an army without a port? Now we hit the monster problem. Even if you land, how do you keep millions of men fed, fueled, and armed? Ports are the obvious answer, but ports are also obvious targets. The Germans could wreck them. And even if you capture one, you might capture a pile of rubble. That's why the Allies had to solve the port problem in advance. One of the most famous answers was the Mulberry Harbors, massive artificial harbor systems designed so the Allies could unload cargo even without taking a major port immediately. This is not a small engineering trick. It's a gigantic, high-risk logistics gamble. Build harbor components, tow them across the sea, and assemble them under wartime conditions. And if you can keep supplies flowing, the beachhead stops being a fragile strip of sand and becomes a growing front. Fuel was another nightmare. Armies don't move on speeches. They move on gasoline and diesel. That's where Pluto comes in, pipeline under the ocean, an Allied effort with major British development work to push fuel across the channel in a way that reduced reliance on vulnerable tanker shipments. Again, not glamorous, but decisive. So what's the takeaway so far? By this point in the story, you should see the shape of it. The invasion wasn't just America storms Europe. It was a coalition machine where early planning infrastructure in Britain, British deception systems, and British engineering programs fed directly into a battlefield where American manpower and industrial scale played a gigantic role. And the Germans didn't experience D-Day as a tidy flag-planting moment. They experienced it as a coordinated system: timing, deception, specialized equipment, and logistics stacked together so their defenses didn't get a clean chance to recover. Now here's the cliffhanger, because this is where the myth cracks open even wider. When the war ended and surviving German commanders were questioned and wrote analyses, they didn't talk about D-Day like a Hollywood script. They talked about what beat them. And what they kept pointing to, over and over, was planning, deception, and technical problem-solving. In Part 3, we're going to confront the post-war record and then answer the real question: how did the public story become America planned it, when the coalition mechanics tell a different story? Now we get to the part that makes people uncomfortable, because it isn't about what happened on the beaches. It's about what happened after. When the war ended, the guns went quiet, and the propaganda value of the moment started to fade. That's when you'd expect the clearest professional analysis to show up, because officers who survived were forced to explain in practical terms how they lost. And when German commanders and senior staff looked back at Normandy, their assessments across memoirs, interrogations, and post-war studies tend to emphasize three things more than anything else. The invasion system was extremely coordinated. Deception created paralysis and hesitation in German decision-making. Specialized engineering and logistics made the beachhead sustainable. That is not praising the enemy. That is explaining defeat. And here's the key point. Those are exactly the areas where Britain's wartime machinery, planning staffs, intelligence systems inside the UK, and specialized engineering programs had been operating at full speed long before the final American-led public story settled into place. Why German assessments matter? Let's ask the question people don't ask enough. Why would German commanders have any incentive to exaggerate British planning ability and downplay American leadership? They wouldn't. If anything, a defeated military tends to protect its ego by claiming it was beaten by overwhelming numbers or by miracles of luck. But Normandy wasn't explained away as luck. It was often described as an operation that boxed Germany in, an invasion that hit with a complexity and coordination that made German countermeasures slow and uncertain. And remember, Germany did have a lot of troops in France. The issue was where those troops were, when they were committed, and how quickly They could respond in a way that actually mattered. That's where deception and timing became decisive. The deception payoff. What fortitude actually bought operation. Fortitude wasn't just a clever trick. It produced a real operational effect. It helped keep German forces oriented toward the wrong threat. Even after June 6th, German leadership did not instantly treat Normandy as the one and only main invasion. Their fear, carefully cultivated by the deception story, was that Normandy could be an early move and that Pas-de-Calais was still the main event. That's the nightmare for any defender, committing reserves to the wrong place and then getting hit where you're weakest. So hesitation became the default. Every day of hesitation was a day the Allies built strength inside the beachhead. That is why it's fair to say British-run counterintelligence and deception systems, operating inside Britain through controlled agents, staged signals, and consistent evidence, were not a sideshow. They were a direct combat multiplier. And this is not a knock on America. It's an explanation of why American troops weren't met by the full weight of German mobile reserves all at once. Because if that full weight hits too early, the body count goes up, and the odds of success go down. The engineering payoff, ports, harbors, and fuel. Here's another reality check. Even if you land 150,000 men, you don't win anything unless you can feed and supply the next wave, and the next wave, and the next wave. An invasion is a logistics contest disguised as a battle. That's why the Allied solution set mattered. Artificial harbor systems, Mulberry, to unload supplies without having to seize an intact major port immediately. Engineering solutions and specialized vehicles to clear obstacles, breach defenses, and keep traffic moving off the sand. Fuel supply planning, including channel crossing pipelines and controlled fuel distribution, because fuel shortages can freeze an army in place. Some of those systems succeeded better than others, and some suffered from weather and the chaos of war. But the presence of those solutions, designed in advance, not improvised in the surf, was a major reason the invasion had staying power. And again, this is where British engineering programs played an outsized role, especially in specialized armor development and the artificial harbor concept that solved the no-port problem early. So why don't most Americans know the names? Now we hit the part that explains the title. If you want to understand why the public memory turned into America Planned D-Day, you have to understand how history gets packaged. After 1945, the United States had three things Britain did not have at the same scale: global media dominance, a massive film industry exporting the American point of view, a public hungry for stories centered on American sacrifice, and American triumph. And again, that hunger wasn't wrong. American families had paid in blood. The United States had mobilized at a scale no democracy had ever mobilized. American troops hit beaches, fields, hedgerows, and towns, and fought through hell. But the way a nation remembers war is not the same as how a coalition actually ran the war. Memory compresses, memory simplifies, memory builds heroes that match the audience. So in the American version, the camera stays with American soldiers and American commanders. Planning scenes become short and symbolic, someone pointing at a map, at speech. A final decision, because the deep planning work is complicated, multinational, and slow. And that complexity is exactly what gets cut. This is how you get a world where millions of viewers can describe Omaha Beach frame by frame, but can't name the British planning organization that built the early Overlord framework, or the British engineering leader whose specialized vehicles helped crack beach defenses faster, or the British intelligence apparatus that shaped what German high command believed in the first place. It isn't that Americans were told a single lie, it's that the story was edited. Not edited to erase bloodshed, edited to erase authorship. The credit transfer effect. Here's the pattern that forms over time. Immediate post-war years. Each country emphasizes its own contribution. That's normal. Hollywood era. American films and TV become the worldwide default. The American viewpoint becomes the viewpoint. Later decades, the simplified version hardens into common knowledge. If you challenge it, people treat you like you're rewriting history when you're actually adding back missing coalition context. And once that happens, names fade. Planners become footnotes. Engineers become trivia. Intelligence work becomes spy stuff, not a war-winning system. So the person the public remembers as the architect becomes the person most visible in American media, Eisenhower. And Eisenhower absolutely mattered. He held the coalition together, managed competing egos, handled politics, maintained unity, and made final decisions under pressure. That's real leadership. But being the coalition leader at the top is not the same thing as originating the invasion concept and building the early framework from the ground up. Both are vital. They are not identical jobs. The bigger context: this wasn't a one-off. Now widen the lens. This British planning framework plus American scale and execution combo wasn't unique to Normandy. Across the war, Britain often contributed deep operational experience, planning staffs, and specialized solutions, while the United States contributed overwhelming production, growing battlefield skill, and huge troop formations. And when that blend worked, it was devastating. When it didn't blend well, when operations were rushed, underplanned, or overconfident, casualties spiked. That doesn't mean Britain always planned better or America couldn't plan. It means the coalition worked best when it used each partner's strengths at the right time, the point you're supposed to walk away with. So let's land the plane, because the goal isn't to turn this into an argument about national pride. The goal is accuracy. D-Day was not America alone. It was not Britain alone. It was a coalition victory built out of different kinds of power. American courage and sacrifice were undeniable. American industrial strength and manpower were essential. British-led early planning infrastructure, deception systems, and specialized engineering solutions formed a major part of the architecture that made the invasion survivable and sustainable. If you remove any one of those, the story changes. And that's why the clean Hollywood version, America planned and executed the greatest invasion in history, is easy to sell and easy to remember. But it's incomplete. It gives you the beach. It doesn't give you the blueprint. Final choice. So here's your choice. You can keep the simple version where the camera never leaves American faces and American flags, and every victory looks like it was designed inside an American headquarters from day one. Or you can accept the messier truth that the Allies won because they combined British experience in planning, deception, and specialized solutions with American mass, momentum, and fighting power. That combination is what Germany couldn't solve. And if this changed how you see D-Day, even a little, drop a comment with your take. I'm not asking for blind agreement. I'm asking for people to look at the coalition reality instead of the movie cut. Next time, we'll keep pulling this thread, because Normandy wasn't the only time the blueprint and the spotlight didn't match. If you want more WWII stories where we separate myth from mechanics, hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming.